It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Kind of strange. We're not really used to it. Truth be told, we're always bombarded with noise. Just think about your day. The TV being on, social media, traffic, kids, phone calls, podcasts, text messages, neighbors, annoying pastors. The list goes on and on. The noise is all around us, and truth be told, it's not just all around us, it's actually inside of us as well. The worry that we carry screams very loud at us. The shame that we have, it's loud. The fear and self-doubt seem to never shut up. The bitterness and anger seem to nag at us constantly. And in all of that, God says, be still. Be still and know that I am. It's difficult to turn it down and to shut it off. I mean, to be still and know, let that sink in for just a moment. That you don't have to be me, is what God is saying. That I have it all under control. You don't have to worry. You don't have to run at a frantic pace. I'm your refuge, and I'm your strength. But you need to be still in order to hear my voice. We're in a series called Soul Detox, Clearing the Clutter and Finding the Creator, where we're hopefully challenging you to step into some rhythms in your life that will help you connect at a deeper level with the Creator. Now, quick disclaimer, these spiritual disciplines that I've been talking about are not, they're not ways really for you to get extra credit with God. And oftentimes that's how we approach them. We're like, man, if we just do these things, if we can check these off on the to-do box, then God's gonna somehow be more pleased with us. We're not trying to show God how deeply committed we are to him by doing these things. It's not, hey God, if I do these things, then maybe you'll love me a little bit more. Please understand, God loves you. In fact, there's nothing you can do that would cause him to love you more. That's the depth of his love. I said this last week, and I'll say it throughout this series. I think it's important. Detox isn't just about removing the bad. It's about making space in our lives for the good. Not just eliminating bad habits, but it's actually allowing good to come into our lives. And none of these practices are in and of themselves. There's really always a so. What I mean by that is we remove the clutter so that we can connect with the Creator. Silence can be a gift. Do we have any parents of toddlers in the room? How many of you parents, you remember the toddler years, right? I remember the toddler years. It was like frantic all day long. They have more energy than the Energizer Bunny. You get to that 7:30 time, they've had dinner, you're cleaning everything up, you're getting them ready. Bath time was always a tsunami in our bathroom. I felt like I needed to mop everything up. Finally get them in their jammies, they're bouncing up and down on the bed. They want time with daddy and mommy. We read a story. Of course, they're the type that can drag out a 30-minute procedure into a 2-hour deal. Like, daddy, tell me one more story. Daddy, do this. And finally, you get them in the bed, you get them all tucked in, you give them a kiss, you slip out the door, you shut the door, and you think, oh, finally. Then you walk down the steps, you sink into your couch, you grab a blanket, and you don't know what to do because it's quiet. See, God wired us, even the most blazing of extroverts, he wired us for the need to be quiet and to be still. He wired us to engage in the quiet, to silence the noise and the voices and the constant input around us, to connect with him at a deep level, to shut off the babbling mess, because ultimately what happens if we don't slow down and we don't calm all of the voices in our lives, then everything begins to become blah, 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 blah. See, without stillness, life seems to lose meaning. Our souls get to running at a speed that they were never intended to run, and we can't hear. We don't notice people. We don't notice the people that we need to notice the most. We don't notice the conversations that we need to have. We miss out on opportunities to celebrate, to express gratitude, to share love, because we're constantly on the move, running at a breakneck pace that we cannot sustain. There's an article written several years ago by Jay Waljasper. He actually wrote several, but this one is called The Time Trap. And in it, he said, speed has brought major improvements to our world, but in taking advantage of its possibilities, we have become blind to its drawbacks. A full throttle life seems to yield little satisfaction other than the sensation of speed itself. We have any speed junkies in the room? You love speed, you love moving at a breakneck pace. Truth be told, that's kind of how I'm wired. I like to get up and get after it every day. Well, for 1,800 years in our culture, from the time of Julius Caesar to the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, 1,800 years, our world ran, you're gonna be stunned by this, of about a pace of 5 miles an hour. 5 miles an hour was the average pace that the average person ran for 1,800 years. Now, maybe occasionally a chariot or a horse or a boat that would catch some wind could get up to maybe 25 miles an hour. Wow, that's fast, right? But in all, it was about a 5 mile an hour pace. And then at the beginning of the 1700s, some things started to change. Stagecoaches began to translate into a faster form of public transportation. We could get up to about 15 miles an hour. We could get to places faster. We could get more and more people there. Then in the early 1800s, the invention of the steam engine totally and completely changed the way that we get around and that we move. In fact, it moved our speed to about 30 miles an hour. Imagine moving at that breakneck speed, right? 30 miles an hour. Then in 1898, there were fewer than 30 of these driving on the streets in America. Would you believe in less than a decade, from 1898 to 1908, in 1908, there were 700 factories in our country producing these at a rapid pace. Then in 1916, two friends opened up this little hamburger joint. For those of you who like White Castle, Bill Ingram and Walter Anderson, best friends, opened the very first fast food restaurant in America. In fact, they opened it in Kansas very soon. A lot of other competitors and emulators would look at their model, and the concept began to catch on that they would place a restaurant in different locations throughout the state and then eventually throughout the country, where parents could take their kids and go through a drive-through, and they could get their hamburgers to go as God always intended it to be. Then just a few years later in 1945, Percy Spencer was doing some governmental work and accidentally invented a brand new cooking device called the Rate-A-Range. Now, what's interesting about this is it would take food and cook it in a few minutes, which would speed up the process from what people were used to, taking several hours to make dinner. Now, what's interesting is these would sell, you ready for this? For $2,500 in 1945. You can buy a microwave today starting at about $100. Then in 1953, the world began to really speed up. Carl Swanson invented the TV dinner. And what's amazing about the TV dinner was it enabled families to stuff their mouths while their eyes were glued to a television. No sarcasm intended there. Then in the 1960s, things began to speed up a little bit more. We don't wash dishes by hand anymore. We load the dishwasher and allow the dishwasher to do it while we can begin to do other things. Then in 1973, FedEx began to deliver packages, and more importantly, packages of papers to different businesses because they could guarantee that they could get there overnight. Then in the 1980s, things sped up a little bit more. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a fax machine. You'd take a document, you'd walk into the office, and you'd give the phone number where it needed to go, and you'd push it through the fax machine, and lo and behold, it would run magically somehow, through the telephone lines and would end up at the other office, and you could get them very quickly. Then in the 1990s, wait for it.
You've got mail.
Anybody remember those days? Oh yeah. It's like it took a lifetime to download an album on the internet in those days. But yet we felt like it was fast, right? Now you can't imagine doing dial-up. I mean, people scream at their phone if it takes 4 seconds to download something. And then in the early 90s, Jeff Bezos in his garage starts a little company that sells books through the internet known as Amazon. Became one of the largest e-commerce, if not the largest e-commerce business in all the world. He actually asked a group of people that were buying books what they would buy online if it could be delivered to their house. And in an interview, he was asked this, or he was telling this story, and he said, somebody responded a refrigerator, and I knew then that I was onto something. And out of that became Amazon Prime, where you can order something in the middle of the morning and have it at your doorstep before the afternoon. And then who would have ever thought that these little glowing rectangles right here would begin to dominate our world? You can email people, you can have calendar and contacts, social media, you can check YouTube and Instagram, Facebook, you can play Fortnite, you can turn on your car, you can turn on the lights in your house or your countertop ice maker. It's incredible technology. You can work anywhere, anytime, everywhere, all the time. Oh, and by the way, you can make phone calls on these things too. Didn't know if you knew that. You see, for 1,800 years, we ran at a pace of about 5 miles an hour. Here's what's crazy. In the last 200 years, we've ran at a pace of almost 200 miles an hour. It's moving so rapidly. Now, granted, sometimes faster is better. When you call 911 and you want an ambulance, you want it fast, right? Or when your wife is going into labor, you need to get to the hospital. When you've recorded a football game or a basketball game, you can fast forward through the commercials. That's a blessing, isn't it? But hear me, faster is not always better. It really isn't. We think that this is good, but truth be told, it's an unsustainable pace that we cannot keep up. I mean, think about it this way. What in your life of any enduring value have you built running at 200 miles an hour? Have you been able to deepen your marriage relationship and your communication with your spouse at 200 miles an hour? Have you been able to learn what really is going on in the heart of your children running at a pace of 200 miles an hour? Have you ever fostered deep growing friendships at 200 miles an hour? See, if that's the case, the truth is we know the answer, right? We know that it's not possible. I mean, can you really then get to know God running at 200 miles an hour, where you have the pedal down and you're blasting through life and there's no time for really anything? And we've bought into and tried to fool ourselves into believing that we can have a deep, intimate relationship with the Creator running at the pace that we're running with. See, when there's no margin built in, you cannot have a deep relationship with God, with family, with friends. You can't even have good emotional and physical health, truth be told. And let's just be honest, even when we try to rest, we lay down to go to bed, but our minds are racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. We can't just seem to shut it off because we've got 1,000 things we want to accomplish the next day because we couldn't accomplish them today. So we're thinking about what we need to do. The wisest man who ever lived, also the richest, just sidebar, wrote this in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. So what do people get in this for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It's all, I know it's not blue. I think that fooled you guys last week. We just changed the color. It's still highlighted, all right? So let's try it again. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It's all meaningless. This is a guy who's made way more money, most experts believe, than the richest of the rich today. If you combined all of their wealth, you still would not have the wealth of Solomon. I mean, let's be real for a second. How many of you find it difficult to calm your mind and your soul? You're at the dinner table, you're out on a date with your spouse, maybe even spending time with your kids or at one of their events, and your mind is just endlessly going through the to-do list. This is why God put Sabbath into our life manual. It's a principle that we're to live because he knows what we need and he knows how we're wired. We need to rest and recharge. We need to have some time to reflect and some margin in our life. It's so we could be still and we could know him. It's so we could be still and we could hear his voice. It's so we could be still and understand what is most important in our world. Something I've been doing lately on my day off in the mornings is grabbing a cup of coffee. My kids all blow out to school and work, and I grab a cup of coffee and I sit at our kitchen table. I have a book of prayer that I go through and I read some of my Bible, but truth be told, I just sit in silence. Friday is my Sabbath day, and I just am learning to sit in silence and just listen. We're just not used to turning it off. You see, not speaking frees you up to concentrate on the inside work that God is trying to do in your life. I'm learning to intentionally carve out time. I'm learning that it's not easy. One of the ways I love to spend time with God, I do this in the spring and fall and even in the summer, and especially in our home when we lived in Ohio, there was no homes to the west of me, so I could sit out and watch the sunset every night. I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of pictures of some of the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets. In fact, this morning, before I came to church, I was out in our neighborhood, and if you slept through it, you missed a beautiful sunrise. Just to take a deep breath and to realize that you really aren't as in control as you think you are. That God is the one that puts the sun up in the morning, he puts it down at night. See, when you slow down and you sit in stillness and solitude, you find out very quickly who actually is in control. I love the passage in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. This is the Message paraphrase of this passage, but I love the way it reads. He says, "Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take real rest." I love that. You tired and burnt out with all the things in our world? I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not, but listening is actually a you first attitude. It's allowing someone else to speak. Many times our prayers aren't really efforts to connect with God. Let's just be honest. Our prayers are a to-do list for God because we've got some things that we need him to do. Hey, God, if you could handle A, B, C, D, I tell you what, you get to work on those today, and I'll check in with you tomorrow to see how you're doing. And oftentimes, that's how we approach God. See, when I talk and you listen, and that attitude is the predominant, I talk, you listen in our prayers, we're missing the greatest aspect of our prayer life. Richard Foster, in his wonderful book, Celebration of Discipline, would highly encourage you to read it if you've never have. He says, the purpose of silence and solitude is to be able to see and to hear. It's to slow down and begin to hear and to see what God is doing and what God is saying to us. See, the Spirit speaks to us when our heart is still and silent, not when we're running at Mach 4, rushing about, doing our own thing. There's something about being alone and quiet that renews us and invigorates us. It gives us a sense of energy and purpose. And hear me, I want to make this clear. It's not just about being alone with yourself. It's about being alone with God. It's about acknowledging who he is and acknowledging who you are and just allowing him to speak. I hate to tell you, there's not a formula of how to do this. You know how you learn to do it? You just do it. You just begin to carve out time to be quiet before God. What I've found is the more that I do it, the more that I want it. It's interesting. The more time you spend before God in silence, the more time you want with him. Jesus actually modeled this. He showed us multiple times, but in Luke chapter 5, verse 16, it says, "But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer." Often got away from the chaos and the craziness of his ministry. Jesus, even by today's standards, was a busy man. He would be around people enjoying their company and healing and traveling and doing all of these things. And crowds were always persistent to have time with him and to spend time with him. And Jesus knew that he needed to unplug and to get away, to get alone with his Father. And see, out of this first things first relationship, that God's first and then everything else flows out of that, then Jesus knew that he was able to do the things that he was needing to do here on this earth. In fact, we see several rhythms in Jesus' life. The first is, before making important decisions, he would spend time with God. You might have heard how Jesus began his ministry. He was baptized. The Spirit of God came on him and led him into the wilderness for 40 days. And for 40 days, he fasted and he prayed to God. At that same time, Satan shows up and begins to tempt Jesus. So Jesus is wrestling with these big time temptations, at the same time trying to connect in solitude and prayer and fasting with his Father. And he found the power to deal with the conflicting voices because he was 100% God. At the same time, he was 100% human. So there's this human element to Jesus, and instead of being focused on power and popularity and fame, which was what Satan was trying to sell Jesus, these are the things that are going to make you popular in the world. Jesus says no to all of them and instead demonstrates to us that being focused on God's plan, and for him it was laying down his life for the sins of mankind, was better. But he found that in the quiet and in the stillness before God. You see also in Jesus' life, he would get away because of the demands of others. I think many of us can relate to this. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus was trending. He would have been had there been social media. There'd been a large group of people, thousands actually. Jesus would feed them after he taught using a boy's lunch of just a few fish and a few loaves of bread. In fact, he fed them and then there were 12 baskets left over. And then he sends them to go home. And Matthew captures this in Matthew chapter 14, verse 23. After sending them home, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. See, again, that rhythm of eventually just sending people home. See, popularity and demands of others, it creates its own set of pressure. Notice I didn't say right after the miracle, he hung around and signed autographs, took selfies, made sure he connected with everyone. Instead, he sent them home. Again, in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, we see that Jesus is busy, and before daybreak, right, a lot going on, before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Later, Simon and the others went out to find him. When they found him, notice this, they said, "Everyone's looking for you." Notice what they thought was important, and notice what Jesus thought was important. They're like, "Look, Jesus, everybody's looking for you. You need to go deal with the thing, whatever it is." I mean, think about this for a moment. People are why Jesus came to earth. Yet Jesus shows us that sometimes you have to put the main thing in its main place. I think he was teaching us something, that even though people are looking for you, it doesn't always mean that you have to immediately show up for them. In fact, in our social media saturated world, our culture reinforces this. Immediate responses, immediate text back. And Jesus knew if he didn't get up early, if he did not get away and spend time with his Father, he knew the day was absolutely going to take over. See, in his humanity, he knew if he did not make time for silence and solitude, if he didn't spend time with his Father, then he would not be prepared for the people that actually needed him the most. You see, Jesus understood that we get the things that we need to face our day from our Creator. In Luke chapter 4, verse 42, it says, "Early the next morning, Jesus went out to an isolated place. The crowds searched everywhere for him, and when they finally found him, they begged him not to leave them." Can't imagine the popularity where you're constantly being chased down, but Jesus was constantly finding a place to get away. Again, when people search and when people beg, it's hard to say no. So the question is, and it's a good question to think about, are you ever justified in pulling away to be alone in times of silence and solitude when people need you? Now, I'm not saying use it as an excuse not to do your job. That's not what I'm arguing. But I think there's something in most of us that believes, how can I take a day off? The company needs me. Honestly, it's been my own experience, the sense of feeling important, the sense of being irreplaceable or indispensable. I'll never forget my very first ministry. I was in my 20s and I love to go full throttle. It's just my personality. It has been that way since I was a kid. I was one of those kids that when my parents put me down, they sunk into the couch and took a long nap. And I can remember in my early 20s burning my candle at both ends, and one of my mentors, Tom, walks in. He was a pastor that I worked with, and Tom was old enough to be my dad, and he looked at me and he says, Sean, I'm hesitant to say this to you because he called me Shawnee and I hated it, and he knew it. You're not allowed to do that. But he said, Shawnee, he said, you need to know something. He says, if you die today, they'll replace you tomorrow. You know, he's right. Every single one of us are replaceable. We believe for a minute that we're indispensable, but the truth be told, we're not. We're just not. John Townsend, in his book, People Fuel, said this. He said, we need to learn 5 words and string them together in a very powerful sentence. And that sentence is, I'm not available right now. I'm not available right now. We need to carve time out. It's powerful, isn't it? One of my favorite things to do with my family is go to the beach. We go every year. We've got our trip planned this year. But about 10 years ago, I made the decision. I was learning something about myself. I would be on vacation when my kids were young, and they would be out on the beach, and I would have my cell phone with me. And see, work never stops, right? It's just the reality of life. You have to be the one to manage it. And I noticed that I started checking emails. I started responding to text messages. I would check in on my team's account. And before long, I'm sitting on vacation with my family and I'm working. It got to the point where I was even fielding some calls. And after some conversation with my bride, the smart one in the family, I made the decision that I was going to leave my cell phone on my nightstand. So every morning I would get up. We have an agreement. If I get up before everybody else, I can at least check my email. But then it has to sit down on the table and I don't touch it the rest of the week. And I found when I did that, there was some anxiety that built up in me. Like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Well, let me ask a different question. What's the worst that's going to happen? And then prepare for it. You have to prepare for the exit and you have to prepare for the reentry. Understand that, okay? My inbox is loaded when I come back from vacation. I was meeting with a group of guys. I was discipling some business guys, and literally every single one of them, there were 12 of us in this group, every single one of them told me they couldn't do that on vacation. And I said, the only person telling you that is you. You have to learn to shut it off. See, the temptation will be to always justify it somehow. And Townsend goes on to say, you just need to tell them you're not available right now. You don't even have to offer justification for it. I'm just not available. Let your no be no. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it's an excuse not to work and all of those things. You got to figure all of that out. But you have to carve out times to slow down, to hear your heart, to listen to the ocean, to dig in the sand and build sand turtles with your kids, because if not, it'll blow by. There are times we need to seek silence and solitude to help recharge our batteries because the daily pressures take a toll on all of us. Jesus had this rhythm, and he's demonstrating something that we need to demonstrate. We never see Jesus saying, well, I'll get to that later, that time with God. I'm going to go take care of the people first, and then I'm going to give God what's left over. We never see that. He knew that in order to be effective, in order to be useful, in order to be impactful, that he needed to connect with his Father. He knew he needed to regularly get alone. I love the way St. Augustine says it in his prayer, one of his prayers. He says, you have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. It's interesting that our hearts are always restless. And we believe and we've bought into, if I can just do this, if I can just get this one extra project done, if I can handle this one thing before I go home, then I will get caught up. Hear me, it's a lie that Satan is telling all of us. And we have to carve time to just get alone with God so we can find rest for our souls. He's just simply saying in that prayer, God, you are our creator. You know us inside and out. You know us better than ourselves. And our souls will always be restless until we find time with you. Like I've already said, culture tends to pull us in a different direction. We become slaves to the pace and the work that we have done. We get addicted, truth be told, to approvals and likes. There's all kinds of research and studies done about dopamine release in our brains. When we put something on social media, we keep going back to it because we want to know if people like the things that we do and say. We're always looking for applause and we're always looking for approval, but hear me, we're looking for approval and applause in the wrong areas of life and by the wrong people. The one who created us in his own image and wants time with us is the one that we need to be getting our approval from, not from the rest of the world. John Ortberg, pastor and writer, said it this way. He says, solitude is the one place where we can gain freedom from the forces of society that will otherwise relentlessly mold us. Isn't it true? If you allow society to mold you, it will mold you into what it wants you to be, but it is not what God created you to be. That's why God built a Sabbath. He built it not as a rule, but as a rhythm for our life. See, we look at it as a check and a checklist to sort of mark off that we did it. But truth be told, it's a rhythm to protect us. He knew that we would fill every gap and every moment and every breath with something. Noise, distractions, television, social media, endless scrolling, constant movement. So silence and stillness seems foreign and awkward. So let's be practical for just a minute. What would it look like for you to take your morning coffee and before you check your notifications and before your emails start piling up, you just sit before God? The warmth of a cup of coffee, the beauty of silence. Or maybe a walk without AirPods. Could you imagine? Just you, God, the sound of your footsteps. Have you ever slowed down long enough to hear your own footsteps? Turning the phone off for 30 minutes, no texts, no emails, no distractions. Just stillness. Just being still. See, here's the thing. You need to know this probably more than anything else I've said today. If you don't make time for silence, the noise will not wait for your permission. It will fill your life with crazy. And it's up to you to make the decision. It's not going to ask for your permission. It's just going to fill it up. You have to make this the most important thing in your life. I want to leave you with this. God is not found in the chaos. I've thought about this a lot lately. His voice is not found in the chaos. Actually, his voice isn't even going to compete with the noise. God is confident in who he is. The thing we have to wrestle with, are we confident in who he is? Because we will only find him when we quiet our souls and our life and we sit before him in stillness. We choose to slow down and to simply listen.
To boost its interest rates up to 18% as it battles against financial collapse. The move is designed to stabilize the short period.
Now economic messages to win the support of undecided voters